Hi, I'm Bill Diorio. Today I'd like to talk about my influences on the guitar. As a player, I've listened to many people in my formative years, of course, growing up and coming up as a musician. But oftentimes, certain people have more of an impact than others when you first start listening and start exploring the guitar and how to play it. So this video will talk about those major influences. The first one was, believe it or not the Beatles, or not a lot of the primary rock people that a lot of people listen to. I was introduced to a band by the name of the Nas on their second album called Nas. And the primary composer for the band and lead guitarist was Todd Rundgren. So one of the first major influences, I would say, for me on guitar was Todd Rundgren. I heard the solos on this album and I was completely transfixed. Not only did I enjoy the solos themselves, but I was a fan of his compositional ability too, because I was hearing things compositionally that I didn't really hear in other rock bands. He had a lot of influences at the time. And the production was quite well done too. So that was my introduction to his playing. Now, in later years, I come to find out that he was very influenced by Eric Clapton, for example, as well as some other British guitarists and other American blues guitarists. So there was a very strong traditional blues influence, but also he had a kind of energy that had his own stamp on it. So he wasn't just a Clapton clone or a clone of the heavy rock people like Pete Townsend or people like that at the time. He definitely had his own sound. And I found that quite attractive as far as his being pretty much the first solos I actually learned from the records at the time. So I would say Todd Rundgren was my primary influence on the guitar years ago. And I was lucky enough to meet him personally several years ago, and that was quite a thrill. I did hear him actually with his band Utopia back when I was in college, but then years later I got to meet him in person. So that was quite a thrill. Now, one of my other, and this is basically chronologically I'm going today, the next major influence I would say also was not only the guitarist, but the band he was in and the musical style that he was playing. Back in high school, I got introduced more to fusion than traditional jazz. I came into jazz through rock and progressive rock and fusion, rather than hearing bebop and etc. and going chronologically. So I heard the band, the Mahavishnu Orchestra, featuring, of course, John McLaughlin, and I was completely blown away by what he was doing. I had not heard jazz guitar players playing with such a rock influence and with such an energy and technical ability as someone like John McLaughlin. Now, of course, his compositional ability, in bringing in Eastern influences in the band and odd time signatures and different things harmonically, as well as the other members of the band all being phenomenal players and musicians. But I would say McLaughlin's technical ability, was what immediately caught my eye and ear, and also his ability to improvise and combine those influences with his bebop sensibility, which he did grow up with. He was definitely, he came from that tradition, but he was able to integrate that with the rock sound, of course, since he's playing a Les Paul through cranked Marshalls, and also having Eastern influences. So the combination of the three I found quite interesting. Now, later on, I ended up getting more into other styles. Now, I did hear years later, I was referred to an album by the name of Brother to Brother by what you might call a blue-eyed soul singer by the name of Gino Vanelli. So on the album Brother to Brother, most of the guitar solos are played by Carlos Rios, who was a student, as I found out, of Larry Carlton, and a session guitarist here in the LA area. It's not only, again, the compositional ability and the playing on the album was phenomenal, and of course Gino Vannelli's vocal ability, but the guitar solos were on another level. As I said, he was influenced by Larry Carlton, of course, but he definitely had even a higher energy approach, and even took on a more kind of technique approach to his solos. And so it was extremely addictive to hear this combination. And of course, here again, the great playing on the album featured phenomenal session players and singers. But it was a huge impact on me guitar-wise, because now I was dying to imitate that kind of soloing and that soloing approach as demonstrated by Carlos Rios. Now, several years later, I started to explore more traditional jazz and traditional jazz players. It was recommended to me to listen to a guitarist by the name of Jim Hall. Now, it was interesting because Jim Hall came from the bebop tradition, but his approach was very compositional. In fact, he was a composition major in college when he studied music. And his approach was not based on the traditional bebop lines a la Wes Montgomery or Charlie Parker. He took a very non-chops oriented approach. In other words, he did not have a lot of speed in his playing, did not have a lot of complicated bebop lines, but his approach was very studied and musical and very compositional. In other words, it was almost like he had pre-planned and pre-written out all the solos ahead of time. They were so well constructed and so well put together and performed. So he was almost, you might say, the exact opposite of somebody like a McLaughlin, who had great compositional ability but was very chops heavy. Jim Hall was just the opposite. He probably could not play fast if you required him to, but what he played was so compositionally strong and musical, it was extremely influential in my playing ability. And it fit for me at the time well, because I was not technically advanced on the guitar at the time. So I think I was drawn closer to someone of his ability technically, and I decided to strengthen my compositional ability soloing-wise, as opposed to trying to go after a John McLaughlin approach, where trying to be the fastest guitar player on the planet. Now later on, I started exploring other jazz players, and another player which I was referred to was Pat Martino. Now he was quite a distinct player from the Jim Hall school, because he was extremely adept compositionally too, or in soloing wise, but his approach was pretty much non-stop right-hand technique. Right? A lot of his lines are continuous 8th or 16th notes with well-crafted phrases, but without a lot of use of space. What players like Jim Hall would do was play very clear phrases and leave a lot of space for other players to incorporate their ideas, or just allow players to listen to what they played. Whereas someone like Pat Martino, once they start soloing, it's almost continuous notes all the way through. And so his approach was, again, diametrically opposed to someone like a Jim Hall. But his energy and his fluidity on the guitar in a more bebop style approach was quite eye-opening. And his just energy level was mind-boggling. And one of the advantages of being out here in LA was I got to see him perform live and briefly meet him. So that was quite an honor. But Pat Martino is definitely someone you might want to listen to if you're new to jazz guitar. If you think jazz guitar is only old guys playing slow notes, that's definitely not what Pat Martino does or did or continues to do to this day. He has an extremely adept right-hand technique. Now, one of the players who I was lucky enough to personally study with was Joe Diorio. He studied out here in LA. I got some postgraduate credits and did my master's in jazz guitar performance. And I was fortunate enough to study with the primary jazz instructor at the time at the University of Southern California, who was Joe Diorio. Now, Joe Diorio had grown up, had played a lot in the Miami music scene, so he got to know players like Jaco Pastorius and worked with them, and Pat Metheny, and etc. But he was such a major influence for several reasons. Number one, because I studied with him privately, of course, but also his approach was quite different than a lot of other players. He came from a bebop background and could certainly play bebop with the best of them, but he also was impressed by people like Coltrane, who were able to take melodic lines outside the traditional bebop harmonic concepts and play some more intricate and outside kinds of sounds. He used a lot of open fifths, a lot of open fourths in his lines, which would create a more outside approach. In fact, his book Fusion is not really about jazz fusion or jazz rock, but it's about fusing traditional bebop playing with open intervals and playing outside the changes and weaving your lines back and forth so that you can alternate between playing very beautiful traditional ideas as well as very modern sounding approaches. And he was a great person to study with. One other aspect of his playing, which was quite influential too, was his ability to teach creativity. He was a very strong advocate of tapping into your right brain as opposed to your left brain. Now, he was very clear to explain that you do need left brain and a sense of theory, a sense of guitar history. You have to listen to all the great players and transcribe enough lines to get an idea of how it goes. But then you need to be able to put away the intellectual approach and tap into the creative side, which is really where the magic happens. And that's one thing he was able to do on a really consistent basis. He had all the great lines of all the great players, but he was able to take it in his own direction and approach things in the moment, and so that you never got the impression that he was playing formulaic lines. Okay, he was always creating in the moment. So if you haven't heard any of his music, I would strongly recommend checking out his stuff, especially his album Bonita, which is, I think, some of his best playing. He he plays traditional jazz compositions, some of them on there, but and which definitely tap into his knowledge of bebop, but you also hear a more modern approach, which is a great way to open your ears to that crossover sound. So those would be the players that I would say were the strongest influences on my playing. If you hear people in my playing that I haven't mentioned, please mention in the comments section of the video. And also, just to make a note, the people that I haven't mentioned are not necessarily unimportant or not influenced in my playing, but those would be the 6 primary influences that I would say were the strongest influences of how I play as of right now. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Any questions, please leave it in the comments section, and have a great day.